19th century Judaism, Jewry, was besieged by unprecedented, hitherto unseen threats to its continuity. The century saw the rise of various movements that were drawing Jews away from Torah. You have socialism, of course, with Marx in the middle of in 1848, writing his Communist Manifesto. You have, of course, the Reform movement that really departed away from Torah and Halacha. You have the Haskalah, the Jewish Haskalah, the Enlightenment, and eventually, of course, at the end of the century, you have Zionism, which many Jews saw as a replacement for traditional Jewry. And that's on one hand, you have these movements. And on the other hand, you have the possibility, for the first time in Jewish history, that the circumstances were there that it was possible for the nation to adopt such attitudes. Previously, they were never welcomed into the greater world. And now, thanks to the emancipation and all the relaxing of the hostility towards them all over Europe, the greater world, with all its tantalizing opportunities, were opened before them to participate. And this trend of Jews abandoning Torah, it quickly gained traction, it made inroads in the Jewish world, and it essentially changed the face of the nation. So assimilation in the 19th century was rampant. Intermarriage was widespread and tolerated for the first time in 2,000 years. Wholesale repudiation of Torah and mitzvos, they became the new norm. And even voluntary apostasy, conversion to Christianity, happened at alarming rates. You could safely say, if we were to survey the middle of the 19th century, the dream of the Jewish destiny, of a Jewish people with fidelity to Torah, that was facing existential threats. Now, nowhere was this situation more dire than in Germany, the birthplace of Reform. Reform began the 19th century as an upstart movement, as a scrappy movement, promising the nation to reduce Judaism into a form that would no longer hinder their acceptance into greater German society. But by mid-century, Reform became the dominant, the entrenched movement in Germany, or the Orthodox, which a few decades prior was the only game in town, it was the only institutionalized form of Judaism, was rapidly diminishing in number, in influence, and in vitality. Even within the quote-unquote Orthodox world, many of the Jews were passionately observing a rote form of habitual Judaism. The zest, the joy, the delight, the meaning of Torah was swiftly becoming more and more rare. In the words of our subject, Germany had, in the middle of the 19th century, reverse Marranos. Marranos, back to the Spanish Inquisition time, these were Jews who were externally Gentile, but internally they were Jewish. In our community, in Germany in the 19th century, there are Jews that are externally Jewish, but internally their Judaism has no meaning to them. They're internally not Jewish. Even the Jews who were observant of Torah, who maintained commitment to mitzvos, they suffered from these ravages plaguing the nation. This was a big problem. And it was a big problem without really an easy solution. In Hungary, for example, these movements were halted before they gained a foothold. So, for example, we spoke about this previously, under the staunch and visionary leadership of the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, he adopted a policy of rigidity by choice. Under the motto, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, anything new is prohibited by Torah, anything innovative is anathema. If there's any hint of innovation, of deviation, of changing tradition, it was swiftly stamped out. Even good things, good ideas, doesn't matter. If it's new, If it's not the way we've been doing, if it's not the custom, it's out. That was the policy in Hungary. And via this absolutist approach, all these movements, Haskalah and Reform, they weren't able to get a beachhead in Hungary, and thus their influence was neutralized there. In Germany, by mid-century, that approach was totally untenable. And it would indeed, if someone were to promulgate that approach, it would fall on deaf ears. By that time, there was a different reality on the ground. Most German Jews had capitulated to a very radical form of reform, and the notion of having this blanket ban on modernity would be futile. And a new approach for combating the threats facing the nation had to be devised. The old structure of Judaism, of Jewish life, was torn down, and a new one had to be built. And as had happened numerous times in Jewish history, a great, innovative genius of a leader arose who adapted Torah to the ethos of the time and created a new paradigm, a new, as they say in German, Weltanschauung, a new way of interacting with the world that would stand as a bulwark against assimilation, but specifically was tailored to the unique character of the people and of the time. This individual, his name is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, or Samson Raphael Hirsch, and his philosophy that he promulgated were couched in the words of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, in Chapters of the Fathers, where the Mishnah tells us, Yafet Torah im derech eretz, sheyediat shnehem mishtachat avon. It's good, it's beautiful to marry Torah with derech eretz, with the way of the world. It's good to study Torah and to be involved in the greater world, because toiling in both of them will make you forget sin. That's what the Mishnah says. He cut out a little slice of the middle, Torah im derech eretz, Torah together with the way of the world, balancing, even synthesizing Torah with modernity, uncompromising on Torah, uncompromising on halacha, while embracing the greater world. This was his insight, and you can make a good case that the vast majority of Torah-observant Jews and Torah-observant communities in the world are guided by the Hirschian ideology of Torah im derech eretz. Now, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch was born in 1808 in Hamburg, Germany. Incidentally, his name is Samson, and his father's name is Raphael. So really, he is Samson ben, the son of Raphael Hirsch. Somehow the ben, the son of, that disappeared, and he became Rabbi Samson, or Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch. And Hamburg is the birthplace of Rav Hirsch, and arguably the birthplace of Reform. 10 years after Rav Hirsch is born, the first Reform temple in the world is built in Hamburg in 1818. And that set the pattern. All Reform temples followed this model. They put an organ, they had a mixed choir, mostly the prayers were conducted in German, many of the prayers were deleted, the silent Amidah, for example, was deleted, and in that Hamburg temple, the new Reform Siddur was introduced, and that became the liturgical standard for Reformed congregations all over the world, including the United States. So that's where Rav Hirsch is born. He's born at the epicenter of the rise of Reform. And he studied under Chacham Isaac Jacob Bernays, who became the rabbi of Hamburg soon afterwards. He was called Chacham, which means a wise person, but it was a term typically relegated to Sephardic communities. In the Ashkenazi community, it was more common for the rabbi to be called rabbi. For whatever reason, Rav Hirsch's Rebbe, his teacher, was Chacham Bernays. Some have suggested it was to distinguish himself from the Reform rabbis. Others suggest perhaps because there were many Sephardic Jews in Hamburg, they would feel more comfortable with a rabbi with that moniker. Now he, Chacham Bernays, was an innovator in his own right. So he was the first Orthodox rabbi in the world to sermonize in German. That was unheard of at the time. Now today, of course, every sermon in every shul is going to be in the lingua franca of the participants. In every Orthodox shul in America, I don't know about everyone, but most, the rabbi speaks in English. At the time, for hundreds of years in Germany, certainly, the rabbis spoke in Yiddish. It was the Jewish language. And it was the mark of reform to speak in German. And I guess technically there's nothing wrong with that. And if that's the language that most people know, maybe it's a good idea to utilize this. Does it say anywhere in the Torah you can't speak in German? It doesn't. And therefore he was willing to make compromises, so to speak, to modernity, and that was a very innovative idea. Of course, he also supported secular education for all, which again demonstrated that he was a little bit of a progressive. And Rav Hirsch studied under him, and Rav Hirsch would go on to be a progressive as well, as we'll see. Now, in the late 1820s, Rav Hirsch is already a teenager. I think he's 19 years old. He goes to study by Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, a famous German rabbi who wrote a famous book on the Talmud called the Aruch LaNer, and there he received his rabbinic ordination. Also, as a teenager, he went to study in the University of Bonn, where he studied history and philosophy and physics and various languages, and informally he began teaching Jewish students. He encountered a phenomenon of Jews who were rebelling against their tradition, and they were coming to university and exposed to ideas that harmed or at least enabled the distancing of them from tradition. And he already, at a very young age, he's a teenager, he starts what's going to be his lifelong mission of trying to bring German Jewry back to Torah and to embrace a Torah strongly. Incidentally, with a twist of irony, in Bonn, he briefly befriended a future antagonist, Abraham Geiger, who was going to go on to become the head of reform in the 1840s. When Rav Hirsch dedicated all his efforts to combat them, they were friends in university for a brief time, and apparently they studied Talmud together, specifically the Talmud tractate of Zavachim, a little historical nugget there. At 22, Rav Hirsch left university and joined the rabbinate and became the rabbi of Oldenburg. This was a suburb of Hamburg. And as was the case with all the rabbis in Germany, this was a government position. And we'll see a lot of his story highlights the fact that to be a rabbi, it's an official position that is overseen by the government, and that has some implications to his story. And this was a collection. His first position was to preside over a collection of about 10 different communities with several hundred Jews total. These were smaller communities, more rural Jews who were less influenced by these new tides sweeping over German Jewry, but were also scattered. And this was what we would call a starter position. He was often unpaid. And that's why. The reason why is because his paycheck came from the government, because he was a government employee. And the coffers from which the government paid the rabbi came from a tax that was levied on the constituents of said rabbi. For whatever reason, maybe they weren't able to, maybe they didn't want to, the people of Oldenburg didn't fill the coffers sufficiently, and often Rav Hirsch was unpaid. But additionally, he was given a certain degree of freedom in time because it was a position that didn't really mandate that he do much. You know, there's several hundred Jews scattered in 10 different communities, only several dozen in each community. How many times does the rabbi need to, how many questions does he get in a given day? Rav Hirsch had a lot of time in his hands, and he used it to deepen his Torah knowledge, and he systematically and intensively studied Torah. But additionally, it enabled him to write, and he became, over his lifetime, a very voluminous writer, and all his writing essentially boils down to one goal: to show the meaning and the relevance of Judaism, of Torah, of tradition in a modern world, and thereby to halt the great lie that reform was opining, that you have to choose, that it's either Torah, it's either tradition, or it's modernity. You could only have one. And that, of course, was their argument to get Jews to come aboard. Join this Judaism, which is a much more watered-down version of Judaism, and you could embrace the world. But you need to go away from Torah in order to have modernity. Comes along Rav Hirsch, and he shows, no, it's very possible to create a confluence of Torah and modernity, and to show how they each indeed can help each other. The Torah will help you with modernity, and perhaps even the modernity will help you with your Torah. And through his writing, he began to try to halt the progress of reform, which was catching on like wildfire in Germany. So the first book he wrote was the second book that he published, and it was called Chorev. More about that in a second. But he writes this book, and he has the manuscript, and he goes to peddle it to Jewish publishing houses. And they tell him there's no market in Germany for Jewish books and Torah of this variety. And the only person who's willing to look at him is a non-Jewish publisher who agrees to print this book, provided that Rav Hirsch would first publish a smaller volume, a shorter work, to gauge how much interest such a book of such a genre would garner. So the second book that he wrote, which is the first book that he published, is one of the great classics of his that he produced. It's called the 19 Letters, alternatively called Igeres Tzafon in Hebrew, which Rav Hirsch published in 1836 under a pseudonym Ben Uziel. This revolutionary work was intended for young people, and it is essentially a dialogue between two young Jews. On one hand, you have Binyamin. Binyamin is an intellectual who, though originally observant, as a result of secular studies and various social contacts, has begun to doubt the relevance of traditional Judaism in the modern era. And he is having this dialogue and a series of letters to his childhood friend Naphtali, who is a young rabbi. And in these series of letters, they discuss all aspects of Jewish philosophy, what's the purpose of life, what's the purpose of mitzvos. And in the first letter, in the opening letter, Binyamin writes what is indeed a thought that many young German Jews had at the time. And that is that, well, Judaism and Torah and tradition doesn't lead to happiness. It leads to misery, it leads to persecution. It's all these prohibitions against pleasure. Why bother? Why do I need it? And Rav Hirsch, of course, speaking as Naphtali, responds in elegant German, outlining the foundations of Torah, talking about Jewish history, the Jewish destiny, what is the role of mitzvos, and all the while taking barbs at reform. He's explaining what Mitzvos are, what Torah is in a rational, logical manner that makes us understand not only what we ought to do, but why we ought to do it. So, for example, in letter number 13, the question of what is the meaning behind the 39 prohibitions of work on Shabbos is. Does God really care if I flip a light on Shabbos, or I light a fire, or I build? Like, what is the moral value, so to speak, of that? That's a good question. And Rav Hirsch responds by telling him that Shabbos really underscores what the relationship of man and man's creator is. God created the world, but gave us the keys to this world. And we could create. And we could be creative. And we could forget God. And everything that we do, there's the risk. There's a grave risk of humanity that we could think we're the creators and forget about God. Well, how do you ameliorate that? You have one day a week that any creative work, any work that shows, perhaps ostensibly, that man is the boss, is suspended. Thus, any creative work is prohibited. And that's the one day you're supposed to tie your hands back, so to speak, and ponder and ruminate on the fact that God is the creator, not me. And this is a classic example of what he was trying to do. He was trying to give meaning and infuse passion and inspiration in mitzvos. And of course, this is a valuable lesson today as much as it is then. And it's a valuable lesson not only for people who are not Torah observant or who are running away from Torah observance, but even people who are Torah observant. The Torah doesn't want us to be automatons. The Umayyad could have programmed androids to do Torah and to put on tefillin. Is that what he wants? No. And Rav Hirsch, he was cognizant that in his community there were Jews who were observant to Torah and they were withholding from all the work on Shabbos, but they were reverse moranos. They had no meaning in it. Inside they were dead. And he's trying to infuse passion in those Jews too. Soon afterwards, it became known that Rav Hirsch is the author of this book, and this sparked a keen interest in German Jewry for anything Rav Hirsch was writing. And it began to sell very well, and 2 years later, his original work, Chorev, was published. And this Chorev, another classic, is a comprehensive book of Jewish law and philosophy. It takes every mitzvah of the 613, and it details the philosophical underpinnings of the mitzvah. Again, the theme, what we do, but also why we do it. What does it do for me? How do I benefit? Why is mitzvahs and why ought mitzvahs be indispensable for me? In the 1870s, Rabbi Israel Salanter, another great personality from the 19th century, he met Rav Hirsch and he implored him to take these books, these foundational books that he wrote in his 20s, and have it translated into all the other languages, especially into Russian. Because at that time, Haskalah was making its way into Eastern Europe, and Rav Yisrael Salanter felt that this kind of ideas that were so successful in Germany could maybe stave off the brunt of the threat, so to speak, to Torah and tradition in Russia. Rav Hirsch stayed in Oldenburg for 11 years, and after 1 year he got married, and when he left, 10 years later, he already had 5 children. Ultimately, he's going to have 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls. In 1841, he becomes the chief rabbi of Emden. This is a much larger community, but by that time, he's already stirred the pot, so to speak, with the reform all over Germany, and there's such opposition to his appointment. At his inauguration, they had to have 50 armed guards to protect him, not from non-Jewish threats, but from his Jewish enemies. In Emden, Rav Hirsch, he founded a secondary school, again with a curriculum featuring both Jewish studies and secular studies. And for the first time, he employed his motto, his catchphrase, Torah im derech eretz, Torah together with the way of the world. Concurrently, in the mid-1840s, Reform was escalating and accelerating its rejections of Torah. So in 1884 in Brunswick, in 1844, in 1844 in Brunswick, in 1845 and 1846, various conferences, they officially declare their positions, permitting intermarriage between Jews and any monotheistic religion, formally abolishing mitzvos, and even toying in 1845 with banning bris milah, circumcision, the most important, or at least the first mitzvah of the Torah for Jews. Geiger, who was the head of Reform at the time, he called bris milah, circumcision, a barbaric blood-letting ritual. In 1847, Rav Hirsch moved to Moravia, to Nikolsburg, and he became the rabbi of the entire Moravia with a Jewish constituency of 50,000 Jews. And he also served as a member of parliament in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In Moravia, Rav Hirsch was constricted. He was caught between, on one hand, the Reform who absolutely hated him. On the other hand, there was a deeply traditional Orthodox element who felt that he was too modern. And therefore, everything he tried to do, all of his innovations, he wanted to establish a yeshiva to train rabbis, and all his ordinances that he wanted to enact were thwarted. So in 1851, he makes a puzzling career choice to leave Moravia, to leave a community of 50,000 constituents, of 50,000 members, and to go accept the position of a rabbi of the Orthodox community in Frankfurt. This is a tremendously steep demotion. This Orthodox community, they were a separatist community. They had seceded from the general Jewish public 2 years prior, so 1849. 11 Jews. They were frustrated with the way the community at large was going, and they obtained governmental recognition to be considered their own independent religious entity. And when Rav Hirsch becomes rabbi, there's maybe 20 families, maybe 100 people, and they don't even have a shul building. And you think about a rabbi at the peak of his powers, who's already authored numerous books or bestsellers, and he's a rabbi and there's 50,000 people who are under his helm, and he leaves them to go to a couple of dozen Jews in Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, he ushers in a revolution. He establishes a community that will become the model for Jewish communities ever since. So first things first, he builds a mikvah. Next, he builds a shul. Then he establishes 3 schools. And then he works on all the other things that a community needs. And in his shul, it became a forerunner of modern shuls today. To join, you had to join the community. They voted on issues, which is a novel idea at the time. Members had to be married according to halacha. So members did not need to be personally observant of Torah, but they had to be at least halachically married to their spouses. They had to have a circumcision. Non-Shomer Shabbos people can become members, but not officers. And within 20 years, the way he structured the community and the efforts, the intensive efforts that he put into building the community exploded in growth. Jews from all over joined, and from 100 people, there's almost 2,000 people, even though they only comprise a minute 50% of all Frankfurt Jewry. Now, Rav Hirsch would remain in Frankfurt for the rest of his life, and it is there that his philosophy of Torah im derech eretz really took off. He taught, again, Torah and the way of the world are not in opposition. Torah im derech eretz, Torah with the way of the world. If someone's Torah is strong enough, then their relationship with the world will complement their Torah, not threaten it. So he was willing to accede to modernity in all matters that were not in conflict with halacha. So for example, what about modern dress? How do you dress? Could you dress like a sophisticated aristocratic German, or do you have to dress like a ghetto Jew? Rav Hirsch will tell you, dress like a sophisticated aristocratic German. Nothing wrong with that. Where does it say in the Torah? It's not in the laws. It's not a halacha. It's fine. Is a Jew allowed to shave? The ghetto Jews wouldn't feel comfortable walking into university with a scraggly beard and curly payas. Rav Hirsch would say it's okay, no problem. What about going to university? In Hungary, going to university was anathema. How could you go and study secular education? Says Rav Hirsch, no, that's fine. Torah im derech eretz, that's okay. He himself, he wore modern garb. He would walk with his wife in public, which was something that European rabbis didn't do that. He spoke a beautiful German. He lectured in German. He wrote in German. He translated the Torah in German. He taught Tanakh, not just Talmud and the Torah, which was innovative at the time. And all this that he's doing is undercutting the core claim of reform. It is possible to embrace the world and not abandon Torah. And he would publicly debate them and publicly ridicule them and combat them unyieldingly as a masterful orator with incisive articles and essays, again saying modernization is great, provided it doesn't compromise on halacha. So he established these schools, including formalized education for girls, a high school for girls, which was revolutionary at the time. It didn't exist in any other Torah community. He brings it in. He introduces secular education to the curriculum. Again, likewise, unheard of in the rest of the Torah-observant world. And Rav Hirsch himself was personally committed to these schools. He would go door to door in Frankfurt, and he would fundraise, and he tried to recruit students as well to his school. And in 1853, 2 years after he arrives, the school opens with an enrollment of 84 children, boys and girls. 30 years later, there's 600 students. And it continued to flourish until it was closed by the Nazis in the middle of the 1930s. And Rav Hirsch himself was personally involved in these schools. I have two quick stories that show not only his involvement, but also his pedagogical skill. There was once a student who received a gift, a ball. And the student went to Rav Hirsch to hear about, what do you think about this new toy that I have? And Rav Hirsch took the ball and looked at it very carefully. And he examined it from every side and said, yes, this is an amazing toy. So that's not much of a story, right? Well, what really happened? But this shows that A, the child is comfortable to go to the greatest rabbi of the entire country and go show him his toy. And Rav Hirsch looks at it and thinks about it and talks to the child on his level and telling him, yes, this is a great toy. Another amazing story that my grandfather said over, that he met an old woman. My grandfather was born in Germany in 1914, incidentally, on the same day as Rav Hirsch was born, 160 years prior. And my grandfather always had a certain affinity for Rav Hirsch. And he would tell over that he met an old woman who had studied in one of Rav Hirsch's schools. And she told him the story that there was once a girl who was misbehaving. And she was sent to the principal's office. Go talk to Rav Hirsch. And she walks in there, of course, with her tail between her toes, so to speak. And you're going to speak to Rav Hirsch. What's he going to say? And he opens up the cabinet and he pulls out a doll. And he gives it to the daughter, to the girl. And he says, here's a doll, but promise me that you'll start behaving. And of course the girl did, which shows, again, a certain cleverness, a certain skill in teaching, in being a pedagogue on top of everything else. Another innovative and maybe controversial method that Rav Hirsch used was with regards to the community. The community was governed by a single Jewish body. And he lobbied, arguing that it's not possible to have one community with Reform and Orthodox Jews together. You have the Reform Jews and they're shaking their bells on Shabbos and they have the organ in the shul. And to us, to the Orthodox, says Rav Hirsch, well, that's unthinkable. And eventually in 1876, the German parliament passes a law which allows Jews and Jewish communities to secede from their religious community and form their own. And at the time, you have almost universally across, or I guess nationally across Germany, you have the Reform dominating all these local communities. And you have individual groups, a minyan here, a minyan there, of Torah observant Jews throughout every city. Rav Hirsch believed, and this was not accepted by all of his contemporaries, that there's a strategy of isolation that would help the Orthodox community be shielded from the harmful elements of reform and assimilation. And he championed the vote for separation. And he would even tell everyone, it's a mitzvah for you to start your own community. Others contended that formal cessation or formal seceding of the Orthodox community from the Reform is a bad idea. Well, what about Jewish unity? How do we give up on our brethren? And those are good points. And there were great rabbis who disagreed and said the German Jews should not form their own little communities, official, recognized governmental communities. But regardless, ultimately, there were two Orthodox communities in Frankfurt, one of them that chose to not abandon the greater Jewish community, and one, Rav Hirsch's community, that became known as Adas Yeshurun. So this is maybe we could argue about the merits of either side, but this does show that Rav Hirsch he thought deeply about how to have a community under such conditions flourish. And maybe it's not for us to try to pass judgment on which approach is a better approach, but it's also important to understand it in context. This was a very different world in the 1870s in Germany than anything that we know of. But more than any other means, Rav Hirsch employed his potent pen to protect and shield his community and to ward off reform. So he founded and edited a monthly magazine called Yeshurun, and he would write most of the articles with masterful, elegant German and with clear, cogent argumentation. Rav Hirsch would present Torah imbued with relevance, imbued with meaning and beauty. With passion, with elegance, he responded and rebuffed all those who challenged the veracity or the relevance of Torah. So, for example, in vogue at the time was Bible criticism, to question the divinity, the historicity of Torah. He lambasted that. He battled and ridiculed Heinrich Graetz, a contemporary who wrote books on Jewish history which went against Torah tradition. He attacked him. He advocated against Zechariah Frankel, his school that he founded in Breslau, which diminished the Jewish tradition. And to all those that claim that it's impossible to synthesize, to have a coexistence of Torah and modernity, Rav Hirsch wrote the following. This is a snippet from what he wrote. It also shows a little bit of his flair for writing. Judaism is not a mere adjunct to life. It comprises all of life. To be a Jew is not a mere part. It is the sum total of our tasks in life. To be a Jew in synagogue and in the kitchen, in the field and in the warehouse, in the office and the pulpit, as servant and as master, as man and as citizen, with the needle and the engraving tool, with the pen and the chisel. That is what it means to be a Jew. An entire life supported by the divine idea and lived and brought to fulfillment according to the divine will. The more the Jew is a Jew, the less aloof he will be from anything that is noble and good, true and upright, in art or science, in culture or education. The more joyfully will he devote himself to all true progress in civilization and culture. He's telling them essentially, the more of a Jew you are, the better you could actually embrace and connect to the greater world. Provided, that is, that he will not only not have to sacrifice his Judaism, but will be able to bring it to more perfect fulfillment. He will ever desire progress, but only in alliance with religion. He will not want to accomplish anything that he cannot accomplish as a Jew. Any step which takes him away from Judaism is not for him a step forward. It is not progress, for he does not wish to accomplish his own will on earth, but labors in the service of God. Rav Hirsch is making a very compelling argument. Torah im derech eretz. When you have Torah, your derech eretz will be improved. He's saying that your ability to have progress, it was a hot button word, catchphrase, talking about progress. It still is today. Well, what's the most progressive idea in the world? The fact that God communicated to us a way to live more perfect lives. That's progressive. To be a Jew allows you to thrive even more in the greater world. And indeed, through his writings, Rav Hirsch was constantly hitting this point again and again. Now, in Frankfurt, he also wrote his indispensable commentary on Chumash, published in English as the Pentateuch, with Rav Hirsch's commentary. It's a comprehensive approach to Torah. Again, he's showing you how the relevance of mitzvos, how each detail of a mitzvah is indispensable to its overarching goal. Also, he wrote commentaries on Tehillim, on Psalms, commentary on the Siddur, on the prayer, among many other books, essays, articles, and treatises. His legacy is hotly debated. Everyone agrees that what he stood for and what he promoted was Torah im derech eretz, Torah with the way of the world. What exactly that means, what's the breakdown of Torah versus derech eretz, is a subject of very hot debate. And there's been a degree of revisionist history regarding this point. It's misunderstood. Rav Hirsch never meant to say that Torah and derech eretz are equal. Of course, the primary objective of the Jew's life is Torah. What he's arguing is that derech eretz does not detract from that, and Torah does not detract from derech eretz. They work together. The goal is Torah. The goal is the soul. And the way to do that, the method, the process, what enables that, that's derech eretz. We can't run away from this world. We have to live in this world. We have to embrace this world. We have to make a living. We have to get education. Of course. But that's not the goal. That is the means to the goal. And it's important to note that Rav Hirsch, I think we tend to underestimate how innovative that was at the time. It was a tremendously radical idea. A rabbi coming to tell me to go to university? That was unheard of at the time. But Rav Hirsch said it and became the standards that we live today in. But he did make some significant concessions. Germany was home to many great Torah giants over history. Rav Hirsch and Torah im derech eretz succeeded in creating legions of Torah-observant Jews, of people that had strict fidelity to mitzvos, to observance, to tradition. However, it did not succeed in developing, in spawning legions of Torah giants. The indisputable fact is that Torah and Derech Eretz, it demands a certain compromise in how far Torah could go. Perhaps it was a calculated risk, and everyone seems to agree that Rav Hirsch did what was necessary for the time. And maybe we're still in that time, who knows? But it's a mistake to say that he would argue that Torah and Derech Eretz are equal, number one, but it's also a mistake to say that this is the recipe for Torah greatness. Because the facts on the ground are that Germany produced only a paltry amount of Torah giants from the 19th and 20th century. It produced a few, but much fewer than all the other communities that didn't adopt this approach. The sages have, modern sages have said that what Rav Hirsch did was hora'as shah. It was an edict for the times, which means that sometimes the circumstances change, and that demands a unique perspective, a unique approach. Is it an ideal for all times? Is this the path we choose? Should we tell Rabbi Akiva, go to university? Of course not. Right? If all the options were available to us, we would not choose Torah and Derech Eretz. But in Germany, in the 19th and 20th century, not all options were available to us. And therefore, at that time, that was the decision that was made. And even with the decision that was made, the Torah was the primary, and the Derech Eretz, the way of the world, it was secondary, it was enabling. Rav Hirsch, when he died in 1888, he was replaced by his son-in-law, Shlomo Zalman Breuer, Rabbi Dr. Solomon Breuer. When he died in 1926, his son, Rabbi Joseph Breuer, lost the election to replace his father as Rabbi of Frankfurt, but he did succeed him as Rosh Yeshiva, as head of the yeshiva in Frankfurt. My grandfather, when he was a teenager, he studied for a year under Rav Breuer in the yeshiva in Frankfurt. During the chaos of Hitler's rise, Rav Breuer moved to the United States. And in Washington Heights, a neighborhood in Manhattan, he founded a community with a shul in the same model of Rav Hirsch in Frankfurt, with schools and with the same attitude of integration of Torah and Derech Eretz, and it still exists today. We could say about Rav Hirsch that he stood up to the plate and developed a foundation that has paved the way for our encounter with the modern world, has forged the path for us today and for the people of his time to be comfortable in the world, while still maintaining Torah through his writings, through his community buildings, through his great innovations in education, through his efforts to give us the meaning behind mitzvos, to reignite the joy and the pride and the optimism amongst the people. Rav Hirsch is one of the great innovative Torah leaders of all time, and he developed a people-specific approach of navigating these great perils that 19th century German Jewry faced. I thank you all. If you have any questions or comments, you could always email me, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. And I'll take any questions.
Is this a precursor to the conservative movement?
Rav Hirsch?
Yeah.
No. I would say Zechariah Frankel was a precursor to the conservative movement. And remember, these movements all change. So the conservative reform movement today and the reform movement of Rav Hirsch, they're different movements. And even I would say the reform movement that Rav Hirsch encountered, the reform movement in the United States in the 1880s were different. And certainly the conservative movement that was founded in the United States in I think 1886, and that also changed. It's a very dynamic movement.
Yeah, because I know the conservative movement was a reaction that reform had gone way too far.
Oh,
and
yes.
moving back.
Right. So Rav Hirsch wouldn't say reform has gone way too far. Rav Hirsch would say reform has gone off a cliff. That's what he would say. What the conservative